Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a major structural shift in Malta's education sector, the newly released MFHEA Communication 05-2026. This framework completely rewrites the rules on what languages educational institutions can actually use to teach their students. But as we dig into it, it leaves us with a pretty massive question that we need to answer. Does this new framework truly open doors for multilingual education, or is it actually a burdensome regulatory iceberg, just waiting to sink smaller providers? Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the structured journey we're taking today to uncover the operational and legal layers beneath this policy. We'll start with the new language rules, look at the burden of compliance, explore professional realities, check out governance and transparency, review European precedents, and finally, wrap up with our verdict and alternatives. Section 1. The new language rules. Let's look at the visible tip of the iceberg, the shift from an absolute restriction to conditional access. To anchor our discussion, we have to look at the primary source document, MFHEA Communication 05/2026. Issued on June 25, 2026, this policy officially replaces the entirely closed approach of the old Circular 10/2025. And instead of a single restrictive rule, it introduces two distinct new policies. One for further education at MQF levels 1 through 4, and one for higher education at MQF levels 5 through 8. Here's exactly what changed on paper. Under the old Circular 10/2025, there was just a blanket prohibition on non-English and non-Maltese instruction, unless, of course, you were specifically teaching a language. Now, with Communication 05/2026, we have a system of conditional case-by-case approval. This is undeniably a meaningful improvement for the sector. Additional languages are no longer categorically excluded, meaning providers actually have a formal route to apply for multilingual delivery. Now, what's really interesting about this is how cleanly it distinguishes the parallel yet fundamentally different approval routes. For further education, or FE, you can request an additional language right during initial accreditation or later, and it costs a flat €250 fee. But for higher education, or HE, the main program has to first be fully accredited in Maltese or English. Only then does the new language go through a completely separate, comparability-based process, subjecting you to full program accreditation fees every single time you want to add a language. Section 2. The burden of compliance. Let's move just below the surface and examine the grueling, practical impacts on licensed providers. This brings us to a really important transitional question, and we need to challenge our initial assumptions here. While the blanket ban is gone, we have to ask, does this new route actually create a genuine opening for multilingual education, or does it merely replace a formal prohibition with an overly complex, incredibly burdensome administrative maze? Well, the operational friction quickly becomes apparent. Providers don't just get a translation checked once. No, they are actually required to keep the baseline English or Maltese version of the program fully operationally deliverable and adequately staffed throughout the entire accreditation cycle. Think about what that actually means in practice. If an institution designs a program specifically for a foreign linguistic community, they still have to pay to maintain a parallel English or Maltese version with full staff and resources, even if there is literally zero student demand for it. Add to that the recurring costs of certified translators, translating the institution's entire website, and sourcing all core learning resources without relying on English texts. It also raises massive questions about assessment comparability, the availability of external evaluators in these new languages, a complete lack of transitional arrangements, and the looming risk of having your approval completely suspended or withdrawn if these duplicative standards slip. Then we hit the strict language thresholds. The policy demands a uniform minimum CEFR level C1 proficiency for all teaching staff and a minimum B2 proficiency for enrolling students. While a C1 for teachers might make total sense in a strict academic context, applying a blanket B2 entry requirement for students across every single discipline and level is incredibly rigid. Is a B2 level genuinely justified for, say, a level 1 or 2 vocational further education course? Language competence should really be connected to the actual demands of the program, rather than just relying on a one-size-fits-all metric. Section 3. Professional and vocational realities. This is where we look at the specific friction this policy creates for labor market needs. So, the crucial point here is that we must explicitly categorize the 4 different types of language uses to prevent regulatory confusion. First, there's the regulatory language, which is used for accreditation master files. Second, the teaching language, used for instruction and assessment. Third, the operational language, used to actually run the provider's administration. And finally, the professional language, which is what the students actually need for their future employment. Blurring these four distinct things together is exactly why a uniform policy becomes so problematic. Let me give you an example. Imagine a vocational program preparing an international student for a role in an Italian-speaking tourism operation, or maybe a French-speaking care environment. There's a totally sound educational reason to teach and assess those students in Italian or French. By forcing the provider to maintain a mandatory English baseline, the regulator is imposing a massive cost that doesn't serve the student's actual professional needs at all. Student protection shouldn't automatically mean English or Maltese. It should mean ensuring students can achieve their specific outcomes and safely enter their target cross-border labor market. Section 4, Governance, Law, and Transparency. Let's dive deeper into the legal architecture and institutional provenance under Chapter 607. Subsidiary Legislation 607.03 provides general licensing and accreditation powers, but importantly, it does not expressly establish the detailed language requirements we're seeing in Communication 05-2026. This 2024 quote from the NQAA External Review of the MFHEA is incredibly telling. It clearly recommends that the authority should engage a broader range of stakeholders and seriously consider the student viewpoint when designing accreditation methodologies. And that sets up a noticeable tension with how these new language policies were actually rolled out. Because when we look at that rollout, several transparency concerns really jump out. There was no publicly documented stakeholder consultation. There are missing impact assessments explaining why these heavy restrictions were chosen over less burdensome alternatives. Furthermore, criteria like societal need remain completely undefined, giving the authority massive unchecked discretion. And structurally, while the CEO's signature is on the communication, the publication itself doesn't identify the specific approving body, like the Quality Assurance Committee or the MFHEA Board, or the evidence they considered. Now, a CEO's signature doesn't automatically mean proper approval was absent, and we aren't saying the policies are legally invalid. But objectively speaking, the public evidence of consultation and institutional provenance is missing. And this brilliantly illustrates a fascinating institutional tension. In March 2026, the MFHEA CEO represented Malta at the Council of Europe, publicly stating that a more gradual and consultative approach is advisable when discussing things like academic freedom, the growing dominance of English, student rights, and multilingualism. Yet, just a few months later in June, this domestic policy rollout saw immediate entry into force without any of that public consultation. It highlights a really stark contrast between Malta's progressive public positions in Europe versus its immediate defensive domestic policies at home. Section 5, European Principles and Precedents. Let's reach the deep waters of the analysis and see how European case law actually views this. First up, we need a vital misconception check. It is a highly inaccurate claim that European courts completely prohibit the regulation of a language of instruction. They simply don't. Public authorities absolutely can regulate language use to legitimately protect official languages. However, to avoid illegally restricting freedom of establishment, institutional autonomy, or access to education, these restrictions must meet strict legal tests. They have to be justified, proportionate, transparent, based on objective criteria, and absolutely capable of accommodating exceptions where appropriate. European case law unpacks this really clearly. In the Silovics case, the Court of Justice established that requiring the official language is a restriction that must be proportionate. In the Vilnius case, it was reinforced that official language requirements fail if no flexible exceptions are available. And the Loss case showed that exclusive official language formalities are rejected when a less restrictive alternative actually exists. So, European law clearly establishes that language requirements cannot just be undifferentiated blanket rules. Section 6, the verdict and alternatives. Let's move to our final synthesis and see how this all builds together. If we balance the framework fairly, its strongest elements are that it officially ends the blanket ban, and it does genuinely attempt to protect baseline educational quality. But its main regulatory and operational weaknesses are severe. Its highly defensive design creates massive duplicative operational costs, like forcing a provider to run an unused parallel ghost program. It uses rigidly uniform language thresholds regardless of course level, and it suffers from a major lack of transparency in its design. It's an operational opening for sure, but it acts as a highly costly compliance burden. So what are the practical, less restrictive alternatives that protect quality without creating disproportionate market barriers? First, let providers maintain a regulatory master file in English or Maltese for audit purposes, without actually forcing them to operationally staff a ghost program. Second, use a focused language delivery addendum for the translations and staff checks, rather than charging full fees for a whole new accreditation. Third, implement risk-based language thresholds that actually match the MQF level of the course. And fourth, allow reliance on foreign language academic literature, especially when the best professional evidence out there is in that target language.
Which leaves us with this final thought, and the main questions MFHEA still needs to answer. Quality assurance is absolutely non-negotiable. But how can regulators balance that rigorous QA with true educational internationalization, without relying on prohibitive, costly duplication? If Malta truly wants to serve cross-border labor markets and embrace multilingualism, its regulatory frameworks have to empower providers, not just audit them into exhaustion. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this deep dive has given you a much clearer picture of the currents moving beneath Malta's education policies.